Okay, first of all, thank you very much for your kind welcome and the welcome from your Dean this morning and from the university. It's great to be here. This is my second time in the country. It's wonderful to be in Rostov. I'm very grateful to you for your kind invitation, and a very interesting conference, I think you will agree, looks to be in prospect. My aim today is to talk about academic writing, particularly second language, that's the L2 part, second language academic writing, and particularly looking at the cognitive processes, in other words, the mental processes which we use when we are engaged in this rather difficult activity of academic writing. I want to start by introducing myself a little bit. My name is Stephen Bax and I'm based at Krella, which is, as you can see on the screen, the Centre for Research in English Language Learning and Assessment. So our special area of interest is in fact assessment. How do we assess language, particularly academic language? So some of what I'll talk about today is assessing academic writing. I work at the University of Bedfordshire. Let me introduce the university a little bit. This here is a map of southern England. Can you see it?
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sorry that it's a little bit faint and unclear. I think that's because at the time when they made the map it was raining. You couldn't see it very, very clearly. But nonetheless, that's southern England, and you'll see there's London there. Maybe you've heard of London? That's a joke. Just north of London there's a large red spot, and that is a city called Luton, which is not famous for being particularly beautiful, I have to confess. But that is the place where our university is based, University of Bedfordshire. And you'll see on the right-hand side, this is not my house. Yet. This is the research centre, the postgraduate centre for the university. And you'll see there's the swimming pool for students in the front there, or the fish pond, depending on your point of view. So this is the place where Krella is based. We're about 15 staff in Krella, researching mainly English language learning, but also assessment is a big part of what we do. Just a little bit about myself, a bit more background about myself. I've been teaching since before you were born, probably. True. This is a photo of me when I first started teaching. When I finished university, I said, I want to travel and see the world. So I saw an advertisement in the newspaper saying, teachers wanted in Sudan, no experience necessary. I did not know where Sudan was at that time, I confess. Nonetheless, I got the job and ended up teaching in a girls' secondary school in Sudan, the north of Sudan in Africa. My main aim actually was to learn Arabic. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And this is me. Can you tell which one is me? Difficult task?
Easily.
Yeah. Okay, I'm the one in the bottom left-hand side with more hair in different places. Okay, after that, I worked a lot in the Arab world. I studied Arabic and studied in Damascus and also in Baghdad. I was there for 3 years in Baghdad at the time of Saddam Hussein. Have you heard of him?
Yes.
Yeah, I was teaching for the British Council but studying Arabic at the same time. And after that, I worked a lot in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That's me again on the right-hand side, in Sudan again. Then I came back to Britain and worked in the academic world in Britain at Edinburgh University and elsewhere. Most of my research is in the area of discourse, also assessment and ICT, as information and communications technology, so technology in education. The first book I wrote was this one on the left-hand side. Can you read the script in yellow? What does it say? No, yeah, Stephen Bax, that's me, but the one above it, what does it say? Big script in yellow on the book cover. It says taxi. Now you have to turn upside down to look at it. And the cover was chosen by the publishers, but it's particularly relevant for the book for 2 reasons. One is that the book is about discourse and how we understand it. So for example, in reading that word taxi, where would such a word be written? Look at the text, look at the cover again. Where exactly is that word found?
Traffic signs. Traffic signs.
That's not a sign though.
With some mark on the park place.
Absolutely right. In fact, it's a mark on the road. But the interesting thing about it is that to understand the full significance of it, you need to know the context in which it is written. And that's what the whole book is about, discourse and understanding language in context, the contextual side of it. But it's also particularly relevant because my main job, in fact, is a taxi driver. I have 3 teenage children. So I drive them to parties all the time. I only work in academia for a small part of my existence. So it's a very relevant cover in many ways. The second book on the right-hand side has just won a prize as the most boring book cover in history. If it hasn't won it, it should win it. But the title is Researching Intertextual Reading. The contents are fascinating, but the cover is boring. That's my opinion anyway. And that's just recently out this year. And it's again about reading, but particularly about higher levels of reading intertextually when we use knowledge of other texts to understand the reading that we are doing at the time. But I'm not talking too much about reading today, actually, talking more about writing, obviously. Okay, let's think then about the talk itself. What I want to talk about today is cognitive processes in writing. In other words, the mental processes that we follow when we try to complete a piece of academic writing. I'll also talk a little bit about academic tasks. What kind of tasks do we do in university, for example, when we are writing academically? And you might think yourself, many of you I think are students here. Students, by the way, that's a great life. It's much better than being a teacher. So stay students as long as you can. Okay? What kind of academic writing do you have to do as part of your studies? Well, some of you are probably doing journalism, are you? Some of you doing journalism?
Yes.
Or other areas of philology, perhaps? What kind of essays do you have to do as part of your course? That's one of the things we'll think about today. Many universities have different ways of assessing what you know, but writing is still one of the predominant ways, of course. The classical, traditional way, of course, is the lecturer gives a lecture and then says to you, okay, go away and write an essay about it. Okay? You have to go to the library, you have to find certain things, you have to produce an essay, you have to hand it in. When I was in my university undergraduate days, we had to write an essay every single week. I was doing English literature, and I remember they gave us Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is an enormous work like that. And they said, read it and write an essay on it in a week. Okay? Which for me is not a particularly good task, actually. I certainly didn't think that at the time, but that was a traditional way of assessing your knowledge and understanding and ability, was to say, go away, read something, write an essay, and come back again. In fact, we had to choose the topic of the essay ourselves, which again has some interesting perspectives on it. But this is one of the things I want to think about. What are the thought processes that go through our head as we are writing academically? Also, how can we research them if we want to know more about them? So that's the basic topic of the talk today, will be in that area. However, I want to start by considering a first principle. When thinking about this area, we should not just make a guess about it. We shouldn't say, well, I think academic writing is like this. If we do that, we're bound to make mistakes. What we should do instead is research what people actually do in academic writing, and then through that try to decide how to teach people to do it better, and also how to test academic writing. Now, I'm interested in the testing side because we are involved in exams such as the IELTS exam. Maybe some of you have heard of the IELTS exam and TOEFL, which are trying to test people's writing at a high level to admit them into a university, maybe a university overseas. So we need to understand what exactly do the universities expect at the end in order that we can test people to go into it before they actually start the course. So an understanding of academic writing practice, and particularly the processes, is very important when you're thinking how to teach academic writing and also how to test it. Now let's think a little bit about the kind of tasks that people use in university for academic writing. Do you still have essays? Do any of you have essays that you have to do at the moment? Yeah, so the essay, in inverted commas, is still a very popular form. But of course an essay can have many different types. It may be somebody writes a title on the board and says, write an essay about that. Or it may be that they set up the task in some more complicated way. Well, there's been a lot of research into the kinds of tasks that we use in academia. An early study, Bridgman and Carlson, surveyed teachers in 190 departments in Canada and the USA, and they were asking teachers, what kind of academic task do you set for your students? 2 tasks were seen as most typical at that time. One of them was describing and interpreting non-verbal input. So for example, they might be given a diagram or a graph, and they're asked to write an essay about the statistical aspects of the graph. That's one typical task type. Do any of you do that kind of thing? But notice it's only describing and interpreting. The next most common type, according to them, was comparison and contrast. So have you heard of the essay type? Compare and contrast this with this. And then take a position, in other words, make a decision yourself as to which one is better. A fairly typical type of academic task, I'm sure you'll agree. Now, that was at that time, of course. A lot more recent research has suggested other academic task types. One in 1996, Hale et al. They analysed writing tasks in several disciplines. So they were looking at science, at engineering, at economics and so on, at 8 universities, and they identified these as the most common tasks. Short writing tasks, essays again, summary, so you have to read something perhaps and summarise it, a report with an interpretation, or a research paper. Now if you look at these, you can think about which ones of them are more complex in terms of mental processing. Which ones of them require you to do more complicated mental processes? Presumably a research paper, because that's a much bigger piece of writing and involves not only writing, but investigation, reading, maybe an experiment of some kind. So you can see that's a far more complex cognitive task than, for example, an essay could be. And this is what we're interested in because, of course, if we're testing academic writing, we need to know, can students deal with high-level cognitive tasks? Not only small essays, we want to test not only the lower level of cognitive operation, but the higher levels as well. So we need to think about the whole range of task types which are available in university, and then we need to think how we can test them. Now, another important aspect is the issue of knowledge. Research by these 2 people here over many years brought some insight into the kind of knowledge that is involved in academic writing tasks. And you can see from the paragraph below there that at the earliest stages of academic writing, many students are involved only in what is called knowledge telling. For example, what would that involve? For example, describe something like, describe your holidays. Would be telling something about something that you did. Or read this article and summarize it. Effectively, that's a knowledge-telling activity, isn't it? But a more complex task would be below, knowledge transforming. And this, of course, involves not only telling some knowledge that you have learnt, but also transforming it in a more complex way. Maybe giving your own opinion, your own viewpoint, something like that. And their research, and I think this is well accepted now, is that we should, in academic writing, we should be more concerned with knowledge transforming activities, not only knowledge telling ones. Very often at university, and the early stages of university, the essay tasks we are given are, in a sense, too low cognitively. They're simply about recycling knowledge that people already have. When we teach in Britain, when I teach on an MA program, I'm often amazed that the students are not really used to knowledge-transforming activities. They are so accustomed simply to recycling knowledge they've had from somewhere else, instead of transforming it, interpreting it, doing something new with it. So that's why this distinction is a really important one, and obviously for higher level cognitive activity, we should be aiming for knowledge transformation, not simply knowledge telling, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. So just to summarize what we've said about tasks, some real-world academic tasks are quite basic, but some, for example, the research paper, are cognitively far more challenging. And that, of course, is what we want our students to reach, to attain, is the more complex cognitive tasks. We hope that when they go out of university, they'll get an exciting and very well-paid job, which will require high levels of cognitive challenge, and they'll be able to meet those challenges. That's what the university, in part, should be doing, preparing them for when they leave and go into the world of work. Many of these tasks actually involve reading. Now today I'm just talking about academic writing, but of course there's very often an integration between the reading and the writing. And more we're starting to develop language tests which try to test the two together in a more integrated way. But that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow in the workshop at, I think, 11:15 tomorrow. But today we'll focus just on the writing side. So what does this mean for us? Well, when preparing L2 students, second language students, for academic writing, or when we are preparing tests of academic writing, we need to have an awareness of the more complex tasks in real level academic writing at university level. In other words, let's not assume academic writing is a simple matter. It isn't. There are a lot of cognitive complexities in it, which basically we need to understand, as I've said here. We need to understand these processes, and we can only really do that by researching them in detail. So let's turn to the issue of researching cognitive tasks and processes. So we've looked at cognitive tasks. Now let's turn to processes. Now, a very well-known model of writing from 1980 investigated the writing processes of adult writers. How did it do it? Well, they used think aloud protocols. What is a think aloud protocol? Have you seen that strange animal? Does it live and exist here? The think aloud protocol is basically, it sounds very technical, but basically you get somebody to write something, and then you ask them, probably while they are writing, to say what they are doing and why. Okay? So you say to somebody, I could say to Elena here in front of me, she's writing, I could say, as you're writing, you don't have to do it, don't worry. I say, as you're writing, tell me, what are you thinking as you write? Now, this is one way of getting an insight into somebody's writing processes, but of course it's a complicated one, because not only do you have to write, you also have to think and report it, and that may affect your writing. That's one of the problems with it, of course. But there are not very many easy ways to get inside somebody's head when they are writing to find out what they are doing. So think aloud is one way. Now, this could be while somebody is writing, or it could be after they have finished writing. You might say, okay, you finished your writing now, tell me what did you do and why did you do it? Now, in one way, afterwards is better, because you're not interfering with the process, but at the same time they might have forgotten what they were really doing, so there are issues with that as well. So no, none of these methods is perfect, but Hayes and Flower used think aloud protocols to try and investigate writing, and basically they argued that writing is an extended, goal-directed problem-solving exercise. We knew that kind of, did we? Goal-directed, problem-solving exercise, but they tried to get an idea of what exactly are the stages of writing that people go through. And they identified these three, which seem now to us very obvious: planning, translating, and reviewing. Now, translating here is not translating from Russian into English, or vice versa. It's translating from your thoughts into the written form on the page. So according to them, these were three key stages: the planning stage, the translating stage, and then the reviewing stage. That seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? We all know about that from school, actually. But the question is, what does each stage involve in terms of mental processes? That's the key question to think about. Hayes later revisited this in 1996 and tried to modify the terminology. He said, well, instead of planning, let's talk about reflection, because it's far more than simply planning. It's also thinking about the task in hand. The second stage he called text production, pretty obviously, and text interpretation was the third stage. So he still had his three stages. He just had slightly different terminology and understanding of each. Reflection, according to him, was problem-solving, decision-making, and inferencing. Text production, of course, this is the actual writing. And reviewing means returning and re-examining the writing that you have done. Again, pretty obvious it seems to me, but think about how you yourself do this when you're writing an essay. What does the first phase, which he calls reflection, what does it actually involve? Well, nowadays it might involve also searching for things on Google, which didn't exist in his day. It might involve discussing it with your friends. It might involve a whole kind of nexus of things, thinking and planning and so on, which is not simply sitting down and writing a plan. It's developing a sense of what the writing needs to be, with reference, of course, to the task, but also with reference to other things. The second phase, we think, text production, that means sitting down and writing it, doesn't it? But of course, that's a whole complex process in itself, which links with the first process, and then links with the third process when you come back to review it in various ways. When you look at it far more closely, each one of these processes is mentally a very complex one. We take it for granted because we do it all the time since school, but actually the mental processes behind it are very complex and intricate. And although it's said here it seems to be like a linear process, step 1, step 2, step 3, it isn't always, is it? It might be recursive, you might go back, revise, rethink, throw it in the dustbin, start again. All kinds of things might occur. So again, when we present it as a simple three-stage process, that hides some of the real complexity that we're actually involved in when we write academically. One thing that's really important in all of the research is working memory. In other words, short-term memory. This is seen to be a really important element of academic writing, because you have to hold a lot in your memory as you are moving from one stage to the other, or also, of course, within each stage. So working memory is seen as a really important element of the process. Now, I want to turn now to a big study which we've recently finished at Krella, which is my research centre. And this was carried out by Safina Chan, one of our PhD students. She's just finished. And the reason I want to report this is because it's an unusually big study in great detail looking at cognitive processes in writing. So she studied 219 Chinese students who are studying in England on a number of full-time undergraduate programs. Their level of English was quite good, CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference. Their level was B2 C1, which is quite high. You can see they were already right in the middle of their undergraduate programs, but their English was quite good. And they were studying a range of subjects. They weren't studying philology, but they were studying mainly business and those areas, so they were in the business school. What did she do well? She looked at their real academic writing. She actually took examples of their real academic writing to look at them and study them, and look, for example, at the product, what they had actually done in terms of writing. What else do you think she did? Is that enough, just to look at the products of their writing?
She made them write papers just
She forced them to write papers.
No, not.
No, you're right. In a sense, she followed the process of their writing, because it's not enough to look at the product, the written product. We're interested in the processes that they followed. So she actually tracked them over time, gave them questionnaires, talked to them, interviewed them over several months, in fact over a year, and followed the processes that they were involved in as they were writing the product which she could see. And that was an important part of it. She was looking particularly at the reading into writing issue. Because they obviously, as they were writing academically, they had to read, and they had to put this in various ways into writing. But we're just going to look at the writing side, but she was actually doing more than that. She was looking at the reading into writing process. She used questionnaires, she used interviews, she used think aloud, and we'll come back to other methods. Her main method actually was by questionnaire, getting them to report back on why they had done certain things and what they were doing. She identified 8 stages, or 8 kind of cognitive processes which they were involved in. Now, you can write all 8 of them, or I can give you the slides afterwards as well if you're getting tired. So the first one, of course, task representation. Let me just give you all 8 of them, then we'll go back and look at them individually. So these are the 8. Can you see, do they fit in with what Hayes and Flower said about planning, text production and revision? Yeah, more or less they do, but there's a lot more detail here. So it starts off with task representation and macro planning. Why macro planning? Because you're thinking big at that stage. You're thinking, my horrible tutor has given me this essay, okay? I've got a plan. What am I going to say as a whole? What on earth does the essay mean? You're not micro planning at that stage. You're planning the whole thing in a macro way. You're also representing the task to yourself. You might do this by chatting to your friend and saying, what on earth do you think we have to do for this? What do you think? You might talk with people as a way of building up your sense of what the task is. We'll come back to that in a minute. Then you've got, of course, connecting and generating ideas, selecting relevant ideas. Where in this process is the actual writing? It doesn't seem to be mentioned there, the actual writing. Well, of course, that's going on all the time in various ways. So even when you're planning, you might be writing notes about it. When you're connecting and generating ideas, selecting ideas, you might be writing a rough draft and so on. But here we're looking not at the actual writing itself, but the processes involved to get to that stage. Now let's look at these 8, but we'll divide them into 4 sections. So the first one, conceptualization. This is basically the first 2 of the 8, where you're actually setting out what is the whole idea that you have to write. What is it? That's still at the macro level, of course. So this is not only planning, but conceiving of the task, understanding what you do. Now, this does not only happen at the beginning, of course. This might change as you go through the writing process. Okay, so that's A, conceptualization. B, meaning and discourse construction. This is where you put your ideas from stage 1 or stages 1 and 2 into the process of connecting and generating ideas, and you're starting here to move into the translation stage where you're translating from your ideas into the written form. C, organizing. This is where you're selecting relevant ideas from the mass that you had before, and you're starting to put them into a more coherent form in writing. And finally, monitoring and revising, typically, of course, in very good academic writing, has quite a number of stages. In this case, we've got low-level editing during writing. What does low-level editing mean, do you think?
Grammar?
Yeah, it could be grammar, it could be spelling, correcting punctuation, bits and pieces at the kind of lowest level, if you like. This could be during writing or after writing. But this is a separate cognitive set of processes, isn't it? This is the process where you read something, evaluate it, find a problem and correct it. Either at the low level of punctuation, for example, or at the higher level during writing or after writing, the higher level, the kind of macro level where you might change a whole paragraph around or cut out a whole section of ideas and put something new in. That's the kind of more macro thing. Okay, so we've got there 8 elements of cognitive processing. You'll see what I said earlier on, that academic writing is much more complex than it might appear. Indeed, each one of these has its own areas of complexity which are not really very well understood at the moment. Now, let's think about these a little bit. Do these 8 processes occur in a strict order? Do you yourself follow those 8 step by step? Of course not. In fact, you probably didn't realize that you were doing it at all. But sometimes they do occur in that order, but very often, and of course every individual is different, we have our own different way of doing it. But I think the 8 processes are useful to see how a really good high-level academic writer behaves. What do they do? But we must accept it is not the same for everybody, and it's not in the same order. Even that each task may be different. If you're writing an essay with a simple essay title, you'll have different processes from doing a research paper where you have to do some research, experimentation and so on. So we cannot say that those processes are the same for everybody and every task. We must accept that our model must be dynamic and flexible. It can include all of those areas, but not necessarily in a particular sequence. And of course, what we're saying is we need more research under different conditions into how people actually write. So for example, maybe one of you will say, okay, I want to research the people in this room. How do they go about academic writing? And you could follow something like Safina Chan did in Bedfordshire. You could follow people over a year and actually understand better how do people here in Rostov, in their academic writing, how exactly do they think, how do their mental processes operate, and so on. That's the kind of thing which would build up an understanding about the whole issue. Okay, let's turn to the last part about how do we actually research the cognitive processes as we are investigating them. Well, I've said already that Safina and others have used think aloud protocols, which may be getting somebody to write and speak as they are writing, or speak after they have been writing, or else they could write something down on a questionnaire. Again, we're trying to get inside the black box of the mind by using some way where they report what they were doing and try and tell us what they were doing. As I've said already, that has some problems. It can be unreliable sometimes, but it's still a useful research method. Questionnaires and interview, a very common method. You might, as Safina did in her research, you might give hundreds of questionnaires to people, carefully constructed, to try to get insight into their thinking as they write. You could interview them as well. But there are some other methods as well. There's one which is keystroke logging. Do any of you know about that? Have you heard of that? This is basically a piece of software which will follow, as somebody is typing on the computer, will follow everything that they do. Every key they press, it will log it. So if they, for example, delete something, or go back and change something, or correct something, it will log it in a sequence. And you can then get the data out of it to show exactly the process, not the processes, but the steps that they took. Now, to understand why they did it, you still need to think about think aloud or questionnaires and interview. Simply the keystrokes on their own will not tell you the mental processes, of course. You need to go and talk to them and say, I see that you went back and corrected this, tell me why you did that. So keystroke logging is one way of getting insights. Now I want to show you now finally another way, which is EyeTracking. EyeTracking is a way of following somebody's eye movements as they are looking at a screen. Now, there's been a long history of EyeTracking. Over 100 years people have tried to do this. You can see the person on the left who looks a bit like Saddam Hussein, actually. But that was not one of the torture methods. But you can see in the old days there was a helmet with a camera, and the person had to look very closely at something, and the camera would follow them. But you can imagine that it's not a very natural process, very cumbersome and tricky. Same on the right-hand side, one eye is covered. You have to put your chin on a chin rest. very uncomfortable. Luckily, modern technology allows us to do away with all of that, and modern eye tracking systems are simply a screen, like any computer screen, with cameras hidden at the top and cameras hidden at the bottom, which basically send a beam of light into your eye, reflect it back onto the screen, and measure exactly where the eye is moving very, very quickly. But the beauty of it is that the person can do the task in a natural way without feeling any pain or any stress. That's why it's much more useful now than some of these old methods and techniques. Now, let me show you now, if the technology allows, I'll show you a sample of eye tracking. This is a video taken from some research which I did. Now, this is actually a video of somebody reading, not writing. And one reason for that is when people write, they very often look down at the keyboard, so their eyes go off the screen and you lose the signal. And that can be a difficulty. But I want to show you just basically in principle what the eye tracking video, if you like, looks like. So this is somebody reading a language test. On the left-hand side you've got the text. On the right-hand side you've got the questions. Can you read the question here? What does the word it in line 6 refer to? So here on line 6 you have the word it. The question just says, what does that word it refer to? Where do you think the answer will be? Come on, you're all good students. Where will the answer be? In fact, in the first paragraph. Not in that sentence alone. You have to read back over the paragraph. So now, I'll show you the video of this person. This is the eye movements of a particular reader. If the dot is small, that means they focus quickly on a particular place. If the dot is large, that means they look for a long time at that point. So you would expect them to look for a long time round about here, wouldn't you? It. Okay? But let's look at what they do. Also, check to see, do they read A, B, C, and D? These are the alternatives. Now this is in real time, so it's very fast. Okay, are you ready?
Yes, we are.
Hold on to your seats. So first of all, they read the... Okay, so they've already read the question. They're reading A, B, C, D, the alternatives. Let's wait till they get to the word it. This is natural reading and natural reading speed. Notice we don't read every word. Now here's the word it coming up. Don't laugh, you would do the same. So again and again going back over it. Then to the alternatives. Then back to the paragraph. All the time thinking. Trying to work out what's going on. Looks at D again. And finally chooses D. And that's it. That's it. That's correct. Yeah, that was an example of an efficient reader. A good reader. Basically, you can see this is a different representation of a different reader, actually. This is also an efficient reader doing a task which does involve writing, because in this one, they have to write the answer in the box on the right-hand side. So you'll just see that the eye tracking record, you don't need to watch a video, you can stop it and get information about where exactly they look. Now, this was an efficient reader, a successful reader. This one here was an unsuccessful reader. Why? Because basically this reader had no idea of where to look. They just looked thickly over the whole thing. And in fact got the answer wrong. Although this reader spent a lot more time on it, she got the answer wrong. You can see this in another way. This is the successful reader, but in a heat map. You can see the focus was heavily on the question, and then not so heavily on the rest, because this reader obviously got the answer quite quickly. If you look at the unsuccessful reader, very heavy focus here. In fact, the answer was just to the right of that. So this reader was focusing a lot in the wrong places. Okay? Now, this alone tells you nothing about cognitive processes, does it? you need to use this and ask the person. You can say, you can actually show them the video, you can slow it down, show them the video and say, what were you doing here exactly? You can get some insight into it. And what we're trying to do now is use this not only for reading but for writing. We can say, okay, what exactly were you doing as you were writing here? What were you thinking? What were the processes that you were going through? So, basically in summary then, coming towards the end, as I said at the beginning, we do need to research academic writing and we need to understand the processes from a cognitive standpoint of what exactly people are doing as they write. We can then use that, once we've done it, we can use that to help people to teach academic writing and also to test it better. Because your test should represent the real world academic process, of course. We need to research each stage in some detail. So I gave you 8 possible areas to look at. Well, each one of those deserves careful attention. For example, just to take one at random, low-level editing and monitoring. What exactly are we doing as we do it? Do some people do it better than others? Do some people do it more efficiently than others? If we can understand that better, we can help everybody with their writing, and also we can develop writing tests that are more effective. And we must, of course, accept that the process does vary for individuals, but there seems to be a common core of things which good writers do and also which bad writers do. And to do this, we can use a variety of research methods, as I've said, the standard ones, think aloud protocol, keystroke logging, and also, I hope, in the future, EyeTracking will be used for more. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. You'll see my email is there, if you want to take a note of it and send me any personal questions. I'm also, because I'm such a modern person, I'm also on Facebook. If you want to find me, if you can find me, good luck. I'm happy to take any questions, jokes, or insults. Yeah, is it a joke or an insult? Okay.
Actually, it's going to be a question, because I just wondered, when listening to your speech, what kind of community you were researching, studying here, and making your conclusions basing upon. So, and I got the answer. Actually, it was a community of some Chinese students studying in the UK.
In that one
that's a
study.
great difficult difference, because our children are not in an English-speaking community, and their cognitive process might be quite different. What do you think about it?
No, I agree. I think that's a good point. In a way, that's the point that I was making about here. That we do need ourselves to research each stage. Now, I do not know how, for example, undergraduate students here in Rostov, I have no idea what processes they go through. I don't know what they were taught to do at school or what they do now at university. I have absolutely no idea. But if you yourselves want a better understanding of it, then obviously researching it would be an important thing to do. To understand better, just for example, what do undergraduates do here in terms of their cognitive processing. So I think your point is absolutely right, that one study on Chinese students in Britain is not parallel to other studies in other settings, and that's why, in a sense, we need to think about this, each one of us, and make sure that we understand the particular context that we're researching. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Regarding the methods of researching, I wanted to ask: Have there ever been used brain processing tracking equipment like EEG or methods?
I think that's an interesting question. Did you hear that? It's about brain imaging, brain scanning and stuff. I would say it's still very much in its infancy. It's still a very unexplored area, partly because we don't really understand yet what's happening in each part of the brain. So, for example, if you actually put, and also, it's, how would you actually put them in a brain scanner while they are writing?
There are some electrodes that are.
No, you could do the electrode one. Have you ever done that? Has anybody ever done that? Had an electrode study? Luckily, they are not needles anymore. But they put horrible greasy stuff all over you and they stick them on. Yeah, no, you could do that. I think that's possible. But I think it's fair to say that we are still a long way off from understanding enough about how the brain works to make much of the signals that we get. No, it's possible. It's not impossible. I mean, you could actually do it in combination with eye tracking. and keystroke logging. You could do it, but so far no. So if you want to do that for a good study and a book, then it's a great idea.
Actually, as far as I know, there are some attempts of the same type probably done in our country. There are some studies.
I think there are. I think people love technology. The danger is people try and jump too quickly into it, as we found with EyeTracking actually. That technology can only tell you so much. You probably would still need to do think alouds or get some information from that, what they were doing and why, to link up with the brain imaging properly. But yeah, thank you for that question. Any more? Are you sleeping at the back?
It's not a question, but I would like also to comment, because all of this eye tracking and keystroke logging are connected with using technology.
Yeah.
As for me, I can't start writing without writing on paper.
Yeah.
So the first stage is to
Yeah.
just write.
So the comment was that in your case, you start writing on paper with a pen. Yeah. I don't actually. I go straight to the computer because my handwriting is so bad I can't read it myself actually. But we're involved in an eye tracking study with a research project in Taiwan with an exam board in Taiwan, and they said to us the problem in Taiwan is that all of their students, when they are reading and writing, they want to make notes on everything they do. So they don't want a study that only uses a computer. They want a study that will also track how people write on paper, and that's very, very complex to do, of course, because also their eye movements, they're jumping from computer to paper to pen and so on. So that does add a complexity, but I think your point is a good one, that people write, they don't simply write sitting on a computer and typing. Very often they also take notes, they look off, which does add a complexity to it, I think. How many of you just would sit and write an essay just directly on the computer? No? Still 50-50? On your phone, on your mobile phone maybe? No. Okay.
Divide the writing by thinking by writing, spontaneous writing, and planned writing.
Planned writing, yeah. Would you do it on paper? With a pen?
Yeah. Without.
Yeah. So, I mean, it may be that each of the 8 stages that I showed you might involve a different kind of research, because some of them may involve pencil and paper, others of them may involve drafting and redrafting on the computer and so on. I mean, for me, for example, whenever I'm revising, I always print it out and read it on paper, because I find if I just do it on screen, I always miss things. So I always print it out and read it and correct it on paper, and then put my corrections back in. And of course, everybody does things in a slightly different mode like that. Yeah. Any more? Maybe one more? Yeah.
So do you think it would be a good idea to separate language teaching from analytical writing? Because what I feel is that for our students it's very frustrating and complicated to combine it all into a big kind of container or rubbish bin or whatever you like. Because actually what we are concerned about is productive speech, and they are very in at ease with each. Right? And when we mix everything up, this analytical writing starts prematurely, and they are unable to cope.
So you're talking really about English language teaching and the role of writing within that.
Yeah. Is it a good idea to separate writing course for special purposes from English, teaching English language?
I think you could separate them, but the problem is at the end of the day, when they come and do an undergraduate course at university, they need to integrate the skills all together. So unfortunately, there needs to be a level of integration in the way that you teach it as well. So separating it out might not always be the best way, actually. Okay, just let me reiterate. There's my email. If any of you have had burning questions that you have not had answered, do feel free to email me and I'll check later. Thank you for your kind attention.